have as a special guest in the Department of Journalism today, Dr. Mary Gardner, who is a journalism professor at Michigan State University. She is also president of the Association for Education in Journalism, which is the large organization of about 1,600 members, I believe that's the number, of journalism educators nationally. Before going to Michigan State as a journalism professor, Dr. Gardner was on the journalism faculty at the University of Texas at Austin from 1961 to 1966. Her formal college education includes an undergraduate degree in pre-medicine from Ohio State University, and she has a master's degree in journalism from Ohio State University. She has a PhD in journalism from the University of Minnesota. Not only is she concerned about the quality of work in the classroom for journalism students, but she's also concerned about the work that's being done professionally. She has served as a consultant for 6 summers on El Norte, which is a newspaper in Monterrey, Mexico. And while she was on the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin, she was a consultant for the Corpus Christi Caller-Times. She is, if you look at her resume, you'll see that she has been interested and has done a lot of work in many areas of journalism. But she has a particular interest in what's happening in the press in other countries and international press, with particular emphasis on Latin America. She's just returned from a fall conference in Warsaw with the International Association for Mass Communications Research. The special awards that I believe that are worth noting is a National Headliner Award in 1978 from Women in Communication, which is a national professional group for men and women. Because I guess of my interest in work and teaching, I thought that it was particularly important that in 1966 she received a Teaching Excellence Award from the University of Texas, and the way I understand that is chosen by the students. This fall, when Ms. Jackson, who is a former student of Dr. Gardner, received a note that a group of former students was organizing a scholarship in her honor, it was pleasing to me, and even though I'm not a former student, I was glad to participate in that, as well as Ms. Jackson. So I think that is something worth mentioning when you spend a number of years in journalism education, and then former students from one end of the country to the other appreciate what you've done. So they gathered money together and established a national scholarship in her honor. We asked her to talk to you today about how she views the press in different countries. And we think this will fit into your study of the 4 theories of the press, those of you who are enrolled in J301. So at this time, I'd like to present to you Dr. Mary Gardner.
Thank you. I'm probably going to have some problems talking to you since I can't see you very well, and I'm one of these people who believes in eye contact. So if those of you in the first couple rows find me looking at you often, you'll know why.
Look to the right, it helps.
All right. I want to talk to you primarily about the press of Latin America. I think it's terribly important, particularly in this part of the country, that you have an eye on what's happening in your neighboring country for cultural and historical reasons. And I always, as teachers always do, they have to begin by hedging. And so you know immediately that I'm going to be talking about the press in about 19 different independent republics. And I'm going to make some generalizations, and that's always dangerous. It's just impossible to describe the press of 19 different republics. If you stop and think about the fact that Brazil alone has 3,285,000 square miles of territory, I give that to you because it sounds large, but that's larger than the United States before Hawaii and Alaska joined the Union, so that's larger than the continental United States. So we have to talk about the whole area, and I hope you will understand that when I'm talking about it, there's an exception to every generalization that we might wish to make, just as there is in the United States when we talk about newspapers. You can't generalize about 1,750 newspapers. You can find whatever you want. So you can do this in Latin America. You can find whatever type of newspaper or press you want to find, responsible or irresponsible, objective or politically biased, sensational kind of newspapers, or bland ones, or informative and not informative, modern or very decrepit, technically speaking. We forget that the heritage of the Hispanic part of our hemisphere it was a rich one and highly developed culture when the Spaniards went into the area, both in art and architecture. Most of us, I don't think, and I'm willing to bet that I'm right, if I told you that you would be very surprised if I told you that the first universities in the New World were not here in the United States, which weren't then, but in Mexico and Peru, and Dominican Republic, actually. But today, operating today, the oldest continuous universities in this hemisphere are not in the United States. Harvard University was founded in excuse me, I'm losing my dates here. It was founded in 1736, and the University of San Marcos in Lima, Peru was founded in 1551. So you see there's some 75 years of difference. And we have to keep that in mind when we look at the press, the large cultural heritage that existed in art and writing and architecture. So we can find most any kinds of things that we wish to look for in the way of the press. But I think the important thing, since you've all been talking about the four theories, is that we need to know enough about the historical differences to be able to understand why the press is different. And so therefore it's important to keep in mind, as you're talking about the press in Latin America, that Spain and Portugal both had a rigid control over their colonies, a much tighter control over their colonies, and a much more stringent kind of controls that lasted much longer than that of England over its colonies in the United States. Although the printing press came to Latin America in 1536, you see, far before it came to, and I have sent a handout around for you to get kind of an idea of the development. If you look at this sheet that I sent you here, you'll notice that the printing press came to Harvard in 1638 in the United States, and yet it was in Latin America and Mexico in 1536. They're not quite sure between 1535 and 1536. And there were 3 of them in Latin America before we had the first one in the United States, or what was known as the colonies, of course. So keep that in mind, because as we look at the evolution of the press, we'll also see that the newspapers themselves didn't develop more rapidly than in the United States because of the stringent controls that were placed upon them. And we'll refer to this little chart again. You might want to share, if you don't have one of yourself, you might want to share one with a neighbor that does have one. So that the fact that some 100 years before the printing press came to the United States, it existed in Latin America in three different presses were operating, 2 in Mexico and 1 in Lima. And it was controlled by the government and the church through licensing and censorship for a longer period of time than the United States. So independence also, you must keep in mind, didn't come to Latin America until the 1820s and the 1830s. Again, really after our own independence had something to do with that feeling in much of Latin America about the needs to have independence. The influence of the French, Voltaire and Rousseau, and the writings that were coming out of England also had impact on the people, the criollos in Latin America. What historically, what is thought of as to be the first news report as compared to descriptive historical kind of pieces that were being written, about the first kind of news report written in this hemisphere was an account written by a Guatemalan about the destruction of his capital city by earthquake, and that was printed in Mexico in 1541, the first kind of news account. It was a chronology of this terrible earthquake in Guatemala. And yet that was in 1541. And it wasn't until 1722 that the first truly native newspaper was published. And again, if you look at your chart, I've tried to compare England, the United States, Spain, and Latin America here. And if you look at your chart, you will see that the first, in 1722, we had the Gaceta de Mexico, which is a monthly, in 1722. And yet we had our first newspaper in continental United States in 1690 in the colonies, although there was only one issue, those of you who had your history, journalism history. So you can see that, again, there has been a lapse of time. Benjamin Harris's didn't even end up being a monthly because it was closed down after its first publication. But the Gaceta de Mexico was the first truly native newspaper in Latin America. If you look at the other sheet, which I gave you kind of a running account of the evolution of the press in Latin America, you'll see that there were some reprinted papers where they would reprint a newspaper it came from Spain. But it would be a faithful copy of the one that had been published in Spain. So the first really native newspaper was in 1722. Again, I'm speaking in general. I'm tempted to show you that in spite of having the printing press longer, the evolution of newspapers took a longer time. And in fact, they were behind in time lag. And the way that you can account for this is the fact that they were under very stringently controlled colonial government. That is, the Spaniards required reporting back to their mother country, very stringent reporting, and it kept a very careful and authoritarian type of control over their colonies. It was true in the United States too, but of licensing in the earlier days. But the colonies were quite a different kind of situation that you found in Latin America. What happened as a result, I will give you some reasons for this, but I want you to know what happened as a result in general terms is that most of the newspapers and media in general, in the larger generalizing for Latin America, are centralized into the capital city of wherever that capital city is. So you tend to have a centralized newspapers. Even though some of the countries are immensely large, everyone who has any interest in business or art or cultural matters would be taking and reading the capital city newspaper. It would be the same as if all of you felt an absolute necessity to read the New York Times every day if that were a capital newspaper. The capital city, or Washington, D.C. would be the equivalent, perhaps. And we want to read every day the papers from Washington, or you feel that you didn't know what was going on in your country. They also, you will find, because of this, a relatively modern city press, relatively modern, to a relatively mediocre and provincial press. That is, the quality between the metropolitan press and the provincial press will be quite marked. There are exceptions. Argentina and Chile and Mexico, for example, have a fairly well-developed provincial press, and there are some very good provincial newspapers in Colombia. But in general terms, the provincial press is very poor, both technically and in reporting. The circulation of the newspapers in Latin America are relatively small for the population available. And that is true of the number of radio and television sets. All that's changing because of the difference in the development of these countries economically. The capital city newspaper will have a small national circulation, relatively speaking. And these are generally elite readership newspapers. That is, the educated people. And you may have a very sharp contrast between serious and rather sedate newspapers and the sensational ones. It would not be uncommon, as in New York, of seeing the New York Times, which is a rather gray establishment paper for all the business people and the intellectuals read them, and then you'd have the equivalent of the New York Daily News, which is a very sensational paper by our standards. I might add that in many countries in Latin America, the New York Daily News would be a very conservative newspaper by comparison to some of the sensational newspapers there. So you have these stark contrasts. Now, why are these so? I've given you a few hints historically when we began. But the population of Latin America still is largely rural, with the greatest concentration of literate population generally in the cities, especially the capital city. Everyone wants to go to the capital because of the cultural, educational facilities that are there. So this fact alone accounts for a lot of the concentration of media in those cities. For example, it's very hard to know what literacy means and how you define it and how many people read or don't read. Or does literacy mean can you sign your name, or does it mean you can read at what level? So many of our figures are very, very poorly gathered. We have a very difficult time to know exactly what we're talking about sometimes. But illiteracy, let us say in Guatemala City, might be about 15 to 20%. And perhaps in the country, it's anywhere from 60 to 80%. So we'd have a large contrast in between the capital city, the literacy, while in Buenos Aires, for example, illiteracy may be only 2%, and it would be much higher in the country, although there's a high rate of literacy in Argentina. They figure that perhaps in the rural areas it may be 8.5%. I might add, in the United States, we are having, as many of you know indeed well, and have had people tell you constantly, that functional illiteracy seems to be increasing in the United States. And when our colonial settlers came here, they came here, they were an entirely different kind of people than conquistadores. They came here to live. And in pushing through our part of the world, although they encountered formidable jungle, I mean in the sense of forests and not actually jungle, but forests and rivers, and that life was not the desert, crossing the West Desert. At the same time, you have to realize that our life begins in terms of independence at the beginning of the 1800s. Latter part of the 18th century, 79, 80, you see. And that we grew up with technology, that even in the most isolated period of time, we've never had pockets of civilization isolated the way they did in many of the Hispanic countries. First of all, our Indian population was largely nomadic. That isn't to say it wasn't a highly cultured, but largely nomadic, which was not true in Latin America, where when we talk about the gifts that were given to the world by the Indians of Peru and Mexico, most of you probably don't know that the potato came from Peru, for example, and corn and tomatoes from Mexico. And there were highly structured civilizations which had to be conquered. We just, in a rather brutal fashion, pushed the Indians out of the way in the United States. But as we moved west, technology was developing. Stop and think. I believe that the telegraph was invented in about, 1834, something like that, 1838, I believe it is. And think that between 1838 and 1930, just about 100 years, particularly after the Civil War, the rotary press came into existence, typewriter came into existence, telephone came into existence, steam engine came into existence. And so even in our most isolated situation, we were still in relatively good contact after independence with our movement west. I believe the Pony Express only lasted 6 months. Is that about right? Something like that. And what happened? The railroad was coming behind. And on a relative scale, where it might take a year formally for a message to get someplace, then it was in the United States, we weren't isolated that long. Have you ever stopped to think of what a unique country this is, in the sense that we only speak, basically, all of us can communicate with each other in English, which is one of our strengths. That doesn't mean that the other languages aren't important. I don't think there's any other nation in the world where generally, overall, the whole population can communicate. Sometimes we do it very badly, but we can do it. When I lived in Austria, if you were from Linz and you went to Vienna and you didn't speak High or Viennese or High German, you couldn't understand. If you spoke your dialect, you couldn't understand. And Austria is about the size of the state of Ohio. It would be very similar as if the people in Austin couldn't converse with the people in San Antonio unless they spoke a high form of English, so to speak. And that's very common in the rest of the world. And part of this is because as we developed as a nation, communication lines were pushing behind us. We had canals, we had, and all of the technology was coming. It isn't that we were so bright. We happened to grow up in a period of technology. And at the same time, popular education. At the beginning of the early 1900s, popular education was taking hold. And this was also the time that popular penny newspapers were being published. We had an audience to read papers. If you look at the early 1900 newspapers, they're very sensational. Have any of you looked back at some of those and seen how they were written and the kind of topics that they involved themselves with? We have a few papers now in our country that are being started. They're beginning to look like the ones of the early 1900s, I might add. Very sensational. Very sensational. Again, making the New York Daily News look rather staid by comparison. So by the time that we get into the early 1900s, schools of journalism were also being formed. So I have what we call a kind of, this is an overgeneralization, but a parallel development of technology in the communication area, typewriters, teletype, telegraph, radio, all of these things, along with popular education, and journalism education. Our first schools of journalism were founded in the early part of the 1900s. That was not true in Latin America. And the thing that results from this is, technologically speaking, you look at a newspaper in Latin America today, technologically speaking, they can be just as good looking as ours. And unless you know something about what's happening inside, you would say, that paper is, if you don't read Spanish and you don't know anything about journalism, you look at it and you say, that's a marvelously produced newspaper. And they often are. But they also often have reporters who are very poorly trained by our standards, very talented people, but have had little training, professional training. And also newspapers have served in Latin America as a trampoline into politics. Much as our newspapers were used in the colonial days, they are still, it's a very political press, more so in some countries than others. So it's no coincidence, for example, that two of the most respected newspapers, or the most circulation, respected, let's say, intellectually, in Colombia, were both owned formerly by former presidents of Colombia, you see, who founded them and used them as a political vehicle. So as a result, when one politician gets in power, and he has had his own newspaper and has been very vociferous critic of the government that was previously in power about restrictions on the press, often get into government power themselves and turn right around and restrict their competing newspaper. That happened in Colombia for years until the 50s, when things began to change somewhat. So and as a result, because of the repressive kind of governments, there's no such thing as a purely authoritarian government and a purely libertarian government, as you probably have begun to realize. There are degrees of freedom. And in Latin America, that's always been true. But the basic concept has been quite a different cultural concept and political concept of power. So when you find that government comes into power with the concept of being a freer and more liberal government, and find themselves faced with such problems that they, in order to do anything about them, they turn right around and impose the same kind of limitations on the press that have been imposed recently. So as a result, there's been a strong literary tradition. Not only did it come out of the Spanish culture, but that literary tradition, newspapers are still an outlet for poets and short story writers in Latin America. They have marvelous Sunday cultural editions, La Nación of Buenos Aires, for example. Poets still write for newspapers. There were not as many outlets for them, and when you have a dictatorship in power, it's much easier to be more literary than political, because it might bring the government down on your head if you find that you are too political in your treatment. As a result, some of the finest satire that you will read, of course, is also in the Latin American newspapers. Latin Americans have long ago learned to read between the lines. They write about restrictions in France or the economic situation in Spain, and everyone knows they're writing about the country, their own country, and they do this. If I had to make a generalization about the press in Latin America, some generalizations, I would say it takes more courage, more fortitude, more persistence, and integrity in Latin America to be a good reporter than it does in the United States. I would be embarrassed, or I would be not embarrassed in the sense that personally embarrassed, I would be, the word is very difficult for me to find, but I would say that I find it painful to tell you how many reporters have been killed in Latin America because they've been trying to be good reporters. And with a few exceptions in the United States, Don Bowles being one example, that we really don't think that if we write a story we're likely to have a bomb dropped into our house the next day. That is something the reporters live with daily in many Latin American countries. But there are other things. The basic routine statistics that we are so used to having at our fingertips are not available to many reporters. Statistical gathering, if you pick up the telephone and call the San Antonio police this afternoon, you probably can find out how many murders were in the city last night. I hope none, but you know, or robberies, or automobile accidents. That's not true in many Latin American countries. The record keeping just isn't that good for a number of reasons. Or to find out how many people are hospitalized in one year. Statistical gathering is sophisticated in some of the countries and growing, but they just didn't have the people to do it. It's only been the recent 10, 15 years that they have been doing, and it's more difficult for them to do it than it is for us. Public officials just don't necessarily consider themselves servants of the people. The tradition of patron, of being a patron and being a keeper of the people, a benevolent father, the macho concept is there. So you have, you know, and their dignity, a sense of desecato. Does anybody know what desecato means? It's a word, it means dignity. And in many of the countries of Latin America there are laws which say that you cannot offend the dignity of a public official. Laws of desecato. So that if you, the president, you don't criticize the president about certain things that might offend his dignity. That's among, it's a concept. In some countries it's not a law, it's a cultural thing. You respect your elders, and particularly your patron, who takes care of you. Many government officials look upon themselves as sort of kind of LBJ, sort of the father of the people. And they're responsible for taking care of them. And so you find, for example, in Mexico, traditionally they don't criticize the president in the newspapers. The officials about him, other functionaries. It's changing a bit in Mexico, I might add, but that's one of the things that you just don't do with any impunity. In the United States, our concept of having public servants means, oh, we just dig into everything, and sometimes too much, don't we? We invade even their privacy at times as public officials. And that's another thing. Do I have anybody of Spanish American heritage in here? There's a greater sense of privacy among the Latino culture, which I sometimes appreciate, frankly. I think we are losing our sense of privacy. They're just not likely to talk as freely with the press because there are certain things that are just none of your business. They would be offended. Why will we? It's very personal things that we ask. I can remember when I lived in Lima, I lived with a Peruvian family, and Senora Josefina, who was a very cultured woman, and we were a very modest family. If somebody had come and knocked on her door and asked her if she had a refrigerator and a television set, she would have probably said, "That isn't any of your business," and closed the door in their face. So polling and gathering statistics, you know, is really much more difficult. There is a greater sense of internal dignity. There's an ethnos, a Latin ethnos. So you're not as likely to talk as freely or as truthfully with the press. And as I pointed out, some of the basic communication facilities for reporters are lacking. There are telephones. When I first went to the newsroom in Mexico, where I work, there was only one telephone in the newsroom. One telephone for all the reporters. I'm very pleased to say that all of them have their own desks, and we have more than adequate number of telephones in the newsroom today. That's a provincial newspaper. It's not really very provincial. Our city has more than 1 million people in the environs of Monterey. But telephones. The growing, burgeoning population in capital cities, it's just almost impossible to keep up with the telephone facilities needed for the city. And you are on waiting lists for sometimes 2 and 3 years to get a telephone. And if you get one, depending on the country, the time and the place, you're lucky if it operates. I can remember in Buenos Aires about 15 years ago, dialing and listening to 3 conversations. I dialed for half an hour, never did get my party, and I had a lot of interesting conversations that I overheard in the time. Because of the automobiles, by the way, which is a coming thing, the Latin Americans haven't learned anything from us about the overuse of automobiles, because now, as any of you who've been in Mexico City know, the traffic is getting to be a serious problem, and pollution of by automobiles. That's because there has now been. But cars, reporters can't afford to own cars. That is, if they're living only on the salary they're earning. I'm very pleased to say that reporters now own cars in the newspaper with which I work, and we used to have to send them out to cover their stories by bus. Or if it were really an important story, why, they took taxi and had to turn in a chit for doing so. The education, therefore, of our reporters runs from extremes. You will find extremely highly educated political columnists and political writers who, for a newspaper, and you may find the reporters have not had basic high school education, depending whether it's in the provinces, whether it's in the metropolitan city. Some of the finest political writers and columnists, and among the finest cartoonists I've ever seen. I've always felt that many of the Latin American newspapers have much better cartoonists, much more biting kind of political cartooning than we have. They would rank with the best that we have in the United States. But the reporter has always been a chico de la calle, called in by the editor, sent out, run, and therefore not had my, oh, so already, my gosh. Well, as a result of all these, reporters have a tendency to have to work at 2 or 3 jobs. I mean, it's changing, particularly in Mexico. Now I can see it on the paper. We're getting young people like you who are still in college, who are working on our newspaper. Our finest reporter, well, our 2 finest reporters, one is a young man who is only 23 years of age. He's worked on the paper for 5 years. And a young woman who's 24 years of age who's worked on the newspaper for 5 years. Very young, we're building a new young staff. But as you can see, because of the economic situation, in most countries reporters work at 2 or 3 jobs, just like teachers do. And bribery is a constant temptation, and it's very common. And the pressures on them are tremendous. And in spite of that, they have some of the finest young reporters that I've encountered, and that includes many, many of the countries that I have traveled in Latin America. Some fine young reporters who are facing economic and social and political problems every day, who, when they go out to report a story, have the pressures on them of guerrillas who are, if they're not reporting the guerrilla movement well, who they're could be a victim of the guerrilla movement, the government, and their own publishers. So if you, as one reporter said to me in Guatemala, here I am, here, and over here are the guerrillas of the left. If I write a story about them and they don't like it, I have that there on top of me. Over here are the guerrillas of the right. And if I write about the left, they're angry with me. The guerrillas of the left, there's a story about them. And over here's the government. It doesn't want me to write anything about guerrillas. They want me to call them facaciosos, which means criminals. And I'm in the middle. And all of them are coming down upon me. And yet in spite of this, he continued to write. And this is in spite of the fact that one of his colleagues was shot down on the street of Guatemala. I have a very high respect for the journalists of Guatemala, I might add. I thought I'd have time for some questions.
I mean, if you have time, you may stay and ask questions, but if you need to get to another class.
Go to another class. When does our press conference begin?
In about 10 minutes.
If those of you have to go, please. And I'm sorry, I thought I had timed it so we'd have a little more time. Those of you who don't have to go and would like to ask some questions, I will stay here so that we may have some questions and answers. I guess we did come in a little late, didn't we?
About 5 minutes.
Yeah. I always try, when I get in this, I try to give them too much, and I cut out 2 pages. I said, no.